actually means the people of the confluence of the two rivers. So it's where the original village was set up, right where the two rivers meet and merge into one. And that is where the original village was. And then upon colonization and all the other really horrible things that happened, people were relocated, people were moved, the villages were moved, turned into reserves, and the city was then built in that location, which I now think is, well, it's now called 𝘓𝘓𝘬𝘳𝘓𝘬 Memorial Park, and that's what it always should have been called, but settlers upon arriving called it Fort George Park, I think, or something like that.
Okay. So the confluence of the two rivers is actually right in the middle of present day Prince George.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes.
I was there 5 years ago. Did a little exhibit event at Two Rivers Gallery, but you know, with exhibits and traveling to faraway places, you dash in, and then you're thinking, your mind is focused on making sure you don't miss the airplane out, and it's just a running around. So I didn't really get a chance to check out the landscape or the communities. That was 5 years ago. Maybe I should get my butt back there again.
There are some really beautiful places there, that's for sure.
The space is really nice too. The Two Rivers Gallery. That was a pretty sweet space. Is the space that was there 5 years ago the same space today?
Yeah. So I think it's going on 21 years that it's been in the current location that it is, with beautiful architecture and the beautiful art that's gone into it. And it certainly is a very special place to work and to engage in so many community collaboration practices and to really learn from each other and learn from your community.
Is it a trustee board of directors kind of nonprofit society setup, or?
So it's a nonprofit organization. There is a board of directors, and it's really community driven on that front. And speaking of community driven and collaboration, it looks like we have some people present who are here to engage in this amazing event that we have planned for today. I'll start by situating and introducing myself. 𝘧𝘳𝘰𝘮 Yahlnaaw 𝘓𝘬𝘳𝘠𝘮 𝘗𝘦𝘳𝘰𝘮 𝘓𝘬𝘳𝘰𝘮 Hello, wonderful people. My name is Yahlnaaw, and I am from Skidegate Haida Nation, born and raised on 𝘓𝘓𝘬𝘳𝘓 territory, 𝘓𝘓𝘬𝘳, what is also known as Prince Rupert. Spent a lot of time on 𝘓𝘓𝘬𝘳𝘓 territory, also known as Prince George, in which my connections with the gallery and the beautiful community there arose. And I am currently situated here on the traditional unceded territories of the 𝘗𝘠𝘮 speaking peoples. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge again that Two Rivers Gallery is situated on the traditional unceded territory of the 𝘓𝘓𝘬𝘳, and I would like to thank them for allowing us to live, work, and engage in amazing community events such as this on this land. It is important that we keep in mind moving forward that this land acknowledgements and land acknowledgements in general are an introduction to the beginning of a conversation, not the end, which arose in a discussion between myself and Michael previously, which I found meaningful. So from that, I want to say, welcome everyone to our second Learning from Sharing Perspectives Through Storytelling event. This is a recurring storytelling series events that run alongside our current exhibitions at Two Rivers Gallery, moderated by our Indigenous Programmer. This series invites individuals with unique backgrounds to share their stories in various forms, and through the act of storytelling, to explore knowledges embedded within our communities. Our presenters, Nicoll Yahgulanaas from the Masset Haida Nation and myself, Yahlnaaw from the Skidegate Haida Nation, share stories in the spirit of our current exhibitions, all for water and an exercise in listening, featuring artists from across the country and on view in our main galleries until July 4th. These exhibitions aim to provoke critical thinking around the global availability of and health of freshwater, including the social, economic, and political change required to protect this resource for generations to come. I also want to note that this is my last event as the Indigenous Programmer at Two Rivers Gallery as I transition out of my role. The new Indigenous Programmer, Crystal Bayendetti, has just joined the amazing community that is Two Rivers Gallery, and we are so grateful to have them. Michael, could you start us off with further introducing yourself, giving us some background of your work, perhaps in relation to the two videos we will play shortly for everyone, and perhaps how these works came to be?
Thank you. That was a really great intro. And I don't know that I should add too much more about myself other than to say I'm a person of hybrid ancestry, and really, aren't we all, every single one of us? But I was able to live off the reserve for a time in my life and missed the residential prison schools, I suppose. And I was able to sort of observe how other people in the family and the community didn't. And so I felt privileged and protected. And as I grew older, I began to see that the cost of that Canadian embrace was a very high price to pay. So in my almost 27 years of working in politics at the community level with the Masset and Skidegate communities and the 𝘓𝘕 Haida Nation, I saw many instances where Canadian people stepped up to support and participate and ally in a very active way with Haidas. And that encouraged me to, after I left politics, to try to develop a voice in the world of visual arts and perhaps music arts, and we'll talk about that a little bit, to bust open spaces in the walls that separate us according to ethnicity, to make doorways and to embrace hybridity and to make this highly iconic form, such as this piece behind me, to make it accessible to people who didn't and don't have the keys to necessarily unlock the layers of complexity. So the work is very much about hybridity and accessibility. We have two little films tonight. I'll just briefly talk about Flight of the Hummingbird. Set it up, I suppose. I was introduced to this story with work that I did with a Japanese environmental group called Candle Night. And these people, their strategy was to encourage Japanese citizens to turn off all the electricity every June 21st. And they were very successful. There are 52 nuclear reactors in Japan at that time. And they had so many people turning off the power that basically there was one whole nuclear power reactor that was unrequired. So the impact was strong. And they introduced me to the story, The Flight of the Hummingbird, which I illustrated. The book did very well. #3 bestseller in Japan. A sports team named themselves the Hummingbird. And that led me to actually make a trip to the Altiplano in Peru, where the story is from. When you watch the story, the video, the short video by Christopher Octor, who is a Haida from Masset and Skidegate, and very talented animator, I would like to draw your attention to the conclusion of the story, and a little bit of a spoiler, I suppose. It doesn't matter whether the hummingbird is successful in putting out the fire. And I think that's a really critical element to this whole parable. It's a very old story from the Altiplano. It doesn't matter what the outcome of our effort is. What matters is our effort. So I think that I'll just let it lie there and maybe back in your hands, Yahlnaaw.
𝘓𝘬𝘳𝘓 for sharing this and sharing your background and your work's background. I think that's a great lead into diving into the first video titled The Flight of the Hummingbird. So we'll play that for you. We are just having a little problem with the audio. We're just going to quickly see if we can get that working.
While we're working out the audio, let me just say something else about the story, if I might. The story comes from a place called Parque de Papa, which is the potato park, which is a valley high above the city of Cusco in Peru. And it is the place where all the potato plants have come from. And a number of years ago, Monsanto, which is now owned by Bayer, was working with the federal government of Peru to introduce genetically modified foods into the area. And the indigenous people in Parque de Papa were very concerned. It was a slippery slope and that might actually endanger the mother seeds, if you will, for the amazing diversity of potatoes that are there. So it was them against a very large multinational and the federal government of Peru. I was in Cusco one night when, much to my surprise anyways, perhaps no one else's, but much to my surprise, a representative of the state of Cusco, the province of Cusco, got up and made a very fiery speech, committing themselves to work to prevent Monsanto from entering into the valley. And this was followed by a municipal councillor as well. And I think that they were successful, but again, I'm not entirely sure if they were, but they were certainly vigilant and engaged. And in the few years that I was tracking the story, they were successful. But again, vigilance and persistence is required, remaining engaged. I walked up as high as I could in that valley, and being a coastal person, there was a point where there wasn't enough air for me. The atmosphere was amazing. It was like gazing into space. There was just something about the thin atmosphere, and I looked up and I had gotten as far as a house in this valley, and at the top of the house and in the peak underneath the roof, someone had actually worked a hummingbird into the adobe. And so this is where the story came from.
Fantastic. Well, 𝘓𝘓 for sharing that in addition. It looks like we have the audio back, so we'll give it another go.
Here is the story of the great forest that caught on fire. The terrible fire raged and burned. All of the animals were afraid and fled from their homes. The elephant and the tiger, the beaver and the bear all ran, and above them the birds flew in a panic. They huddled at the edge of the forest and watched. All of the creatures gathered, except one. Only 𝘓𝘓𝘓𝘓𝘓𝑒𝘓𝑒𝑚, the little hummingbird, would not abandon the forest. 𝘓𝘓𝘓𝑒𝑚 flew quickly to the stream. She picked up a single drop of water in her beak. 𝘓𝘓𝘓𝑒𝑚 flew back and dropped the water on the fire. Again, she flew to the stream and brought back another drop, and so she continued, back and forth, back and forth. The other animals watched 𝘓𝘓𝘓𝑒𝑚's tiny body fly against the enormous fire, and they were frightened. They called out to the little hummingbird, warning her of the dangers of the smoke and the heat. "What can I do?" sobbed the rabbit. "This fire is much too hot." "There's too much smoke," howled the wolf. "My wings will burn. My beak is too small," cried the owl. But the little hummingbird persisted. She flew to and fro, picking up more water and dropping it, bead by bead, onto the burning forest. Finally, the big bear said, "Little 𝘓𝘓𝘓𝘓𝑒𝑚, what are you doing?" Without stopping, 𝘓𝘓𝘓𝑒𝑚 looked down at all of the animals. She said, "I'm doing what I can."
A powerful video, definitely. Stemming from this, can you tell us more about how this Haida manga, as you have named it, style of art, storytelling, and videography came to be an avenue you frequently pursue in your works?
Yes, and just before that, let me give a shout out to a voice that may be familiar to people in Prince George. That's Lark Clark from Edmonton. I think for years she has been the host and perhaps still is the host of Tin Roof Radio or something where she explores world music. So just a shout out to Lark Clark. Haida manga is when I was trying to figure out a way to make Haida iconography and worldview accessible to a non-Haida and to a non-Indigenous audience, I quickly realized that the way to do that was through graphic literature, which is accessible to people regardless of ethnicity, regardless of education, regardless of class, regardless of language skills. I mean, it goes deep inside of us in a very profound way that written text does not. And so I thought, that's my populist venue there. And I looked around at that time. This was before manga was even an item, I suppose, in literature outside of Japan. And I did not want to make Marvel comics. I did not want to do Archie and Riverdale. I did not want to do a rehash or a manipulation of the European approach to graphic literature. I wanted to do something that had more historical integrity. And during the time as Britain was and Canadians were making their claims to this territory, particularly in the late 1800s, Haida men would work on these fur sealing ships that would sail across the Pacific Ocean following the pelagic fur seal. And even as a young man growing up in the 60s, I heard stories about this amazing place, Japan, where Haida men could walk into the restaurant, could walk into a store, could walk down the streets of a city and and they were accepted as full humans, compared to the situation that was here in British Columbia, as we call it now, where, for example, let's use Prince Rupert. With all the stores in Prince Rupert, all the cafes, there was only one cafe, Smiles Cafe. I always urge people, go to Smiles Cafe. They did not have a sign on the window. All the other restaurants had a sign which said, no Indians and no dogs. At that time, even right up until the late 50s, actually, Indigenous people had to sit in a particular place in the movie theaters. If there was segregation, but in stark contrast to that was Japan, which had probably still does in some minds, this sort of characteristic where we say it's a closed society, is xenophobic, doesn't want anything to do with the world, it's isolated, it's unfriendly to foreigners. And yet I had to compare that to the experience of these men coming back from Japan, loving the experience of feeling that they were a full human person. So much so that there are many Haidas that stayed in Japan. And we probably should do, what's that called, 3-2-1 or 1-2-3 and me, and probably find out we have a lot of relatives there. So I wanted to honor that. I wanted to remember that relationship, that the relationship that we had as Indigenous peoples to others was not always fraught with the violence, the attack, and the aggression that has characterized the Canadian experience. It is possible to have a different kind of a relationship. So that's how I use the word Haida Manga. And finally, manga, or in Korean, I think it's manhwa, and I can never remember the Cantonese term, but it translates as images without borders. So it's open to everything and anything. And it just seemed such a welcome, an invitation to play around with the Haida iconography in a populist way. Flight of the Hummingbird, a number of years ago, was approached by the Pacific Opera Victoria and the Vancouver Opera Companies, and they asked if I would like to write a libretto, the words for an opera based on Flight of the Hummingbird. And at that time, my business partner was still alive, Barry Gilson. He just passed away in March. He had done opera workshops, and so we teamed up, and in collaboration with Maxime Goulet, who's a very talented composer from Montreal, we pulled together a libretto, a 45-minute operetta. Just before COVID, we managed to do a couple of testing performances, and I'm happy to say that full house and a very enthused audience. We had people laughing and crying, fortunately at the appropriate moments in the operetta. So we're looking forward to being able to take that out and bringing it around initially to classrooms. There is a conversation about perhaps based on a success so far, revisiting it and maybe making it an hour-and-a-half opera. Yeah.
Fantastic, Hawa, for sharing all of that in the background and those really important stories embedded within. I believe those to be very impactful. So Hawa, again, for sharing this. I believe that's a really great segue to lead us into the next video that we are going to play, where you discuss in more detail these various forms of artwork that you engage in at Gallery Jones. And the videography for this is done by Shane O'Brien, and it is fantastic. So we'll have that up in just one second.
The magic of the art world is the relationship between the observer and the object. It's not entirely in the object. It's that invisible space, that magic space in between, the relationship that's formed, and the control that the observer has over it is phenomenal. The way you love it is really important. I try not to replicate, well, actually, none of my work do I really try to replicate a classic form. My pursuit is to find that space in the middle where people who don't understand the code, people who don't understand the idiom, can still access some type of meaning, some type of relationship that isn't derived from some imaginary trope, you know, some fantastical narrative. The notion of using copper, there were two things that came together, and one was not only coppers in indigenous economies on the west coast of North America here, but was also, I stumbled across an image of a painting on copper that came out of northern Italy, and I can't remember, I'm thinking maybe in the 1500s. And so I tried that out, and the copper didn't have much tooth, so the pigment just kind of went slurpy and slid across, and it didn't bubble, it didn't pucker up, you know, it actually stayed. So it was really enjoyed that experience, and very quickly after that thought, okay, I'm going to put copper leaf onto carvings. These pieces here, the small flaps, I call them, they're a spin-off, I suppose, or a child of the coppers of the hood. I like these ones because they're a bit more intimate. And here, with the flaps, I kind of feel free to use a bit more color. The coppers from the hood, I kind of like the idea of minimizing the color. There are a few pieces out there that have color in them, but generally, I think that the smaller flap series captures the use of color better, a little bit of white, a little bit of blue. And like so many of my works, water, the movement of water. Aside from my personal history with water, I think that the idiom, the sort of classic traditional works that come from this part of the world off the coast of Canada lend themselves to water, in the sense that water feels like it compresses and expands. You know, as that wave comes into the beach, it's packing a lot of power. And then when it hits the beach, it dissipates and it releases itself. It's expansive. We can see that in the way that the lines work, thick, then thin, and pushing up in such an elegant way. Water is not confused. It has a certainty about it. And I think the classic form really captures it precisely. There's so much going on in the classic form. It's just, it's amazing. And I hope over the lifetime of my practice to be able to explore that and continue to explore that, and perhaps explore it in different ways. There's certainly much more than one person's lifetime. This art form is ancient, and it has spread out like ripples around the planet. You can find in any leading institution and private collections examples of how Haida art form has just this compelling magnetic quality to it. And it's in part, I think, because it captures something deep in all of us, regardless of ethnicity.
Oh, growing up on, it was called the Queen Charlotte's and Haida Nation. It was called Queen Charlotte's by Canada, but so many years ago, art supplies weren't that available in terms of, you know, sort of Western techniques. And somewhere or other, I stumbled on watercolors, and I found a brush. I think it was a sable. And the bristles and the hairs on that brush were so amazing. You could get right down, kind of like watercolors, because they're kind of magical. You're not entirely sure what's going to happen. So I approach the making of artwork today as an artist with an eye to making space for people to participate. Everybody is welcomed. All enterprises require inclusivity, I think, if they're going to have longevity and merit. There has to be room for everybody, that nobody gets left behind.
This is a fantastic exhibition titled Making a Mischief, on display until June 19th at Gallery Jones. Could you share with us, Michael, how this idea, I guess more of how this idea of painting Haida designs on copper pieces shaped as carports, for example, the car hood or the flap, as you call it, came to be?
Yeah. Just before that, so Gallery Jones, which is located in Vancouver, is actually, the exhibit is on until the end of June. And before I talk about the coppers, one of the things that isn't in the video, it's a very good video, it's a lot of fun. I was working with Shane on that, was the collage works, which is a whole different road that's opening up, and I'm very enthused by it. It's layers of historical documents and Haida manga and riffs. But to your question, the copper shields, the use of the copper shields in indigenous economies on the coast, much more so in the past, I'd say, in terms of an economic currency, but still persists today, and it is actively used by people in terms of it becomes a symbol, as I suppose money is as well. The copper shields become a vehicle for transferring, or the transformation of material wealth into incorporeal wealth. And coppers have their own personality, they have their own name, and so they're quite an important item, let me say that, in the entire West Coast, Haida, Tsimshian, Tlingit, and all the Kalas people of the coast. When I set out to try and find ways to connect and bridge and build those doorways, open those doorways between those walls, and I was compelled to do it because I thought, if we know one another better, if we see one another as humans and as sons and daughters and husbands and wives and just regular people, perhaps the level of violence will subside. We won't be demonizing anymore. We'll recognize one another. So it was really, and it still is really important for me to find objects that convey that possibility. So when I looked around in a contemporary Canadian society, I thought, what is the mark of currency here? And it wasn't money. It was not, that wasn't going to work. It was automobiles. And I thought, you know, if we're look out the window one day and across the street and neighbors just pulled up with an electric Jaguar or Tesla or some kind of posh vehicle, expensive vehicle, we assume so much about that household. We assume we know their economic status, you know, how much money they've got. And then we look down on our own driveway at my, you know, 1994 clunker that's, you know, haywired together and belching down the street. And we measure ourselves in the same, so it sort of seemed to form a similar purpose to the way coppers are used to display the ancestral and the contemporary wealth of the owner. As I also looked at cars, I just saw all the amazing technology and artistry goes into this aerodynamic space vehicle, if you will. And the first work that I ever did playing with the automobiles was to take Bill Reed's canoe at the Museum of Anthropology and to put it on the top of a Pontiac Firefly. I flipped the canoe upside down and stuck it on top of the Pontiac Firefly. Why the Pontiac Firefly? Pontiac was a historical leader on the East Coast, attempted to repel the invasions, was unsuccessful, and an Indigenous leader. And the Firefly, I mean, we live in this species of ours has spent a lot of time, effort, and money poisoning our own environment to get rid of insects. You know, we see some little critter walking across the floor, and I bet you 9 out of 10 times the foot is stomped on that insect before the brain is even kicked in and said, why did I do that? So it's this, but with the exception to that is the firefly. It's this cute little insect, and we like to have it in the nursery, and you know, its little ass is flashing away, and we think that's so cute. And in part, I looked at the relationship between Canada, the unsettled Canada, and Haidas, in particular, my own family, many generations of artists. And there was a place reserved for us to be a firefly. We were permitted, we became symbols of victory, affluence, I don't know, you know, totem poles and fine jewelry and stuff like that. But we weren't welcome to flourish in other ways. And so I thought there was a real connection with the Pontiac Firefly, and then taking Bill's canoe and flipping it upside down was a way to say, look, it is a sacred object. The canoe is a beautiful object, but really, if you were living somewhere in rural British Columbia and you were going to go to the lake and you took your canoe, you'd put it on top of the car and you'd drive to the lake. And I was trying to make it accessible. I was trying to introduce a kind of an element of the humble, I suppose, the accessible, the commonplace in that highly fetishized world of art. And then I don't know if it's successful or not, but that's what I'm playing with. So that's why I went to automobiles, the aerodynamic excellence of an automobile compared to the hydrodynamic excellence of a Haida canoe or a West Coast canoe.
Wow, that's so powerful and so impactful, and Hala for sharing that with us. I want us, I guess, to circle back again to the exhibition themes and this concept of water, which I believe you touched on, speaking to the canoes in the water versus cars, aerodynamics. And I want to ask you, how does water play a role in your work? I noticed in the film that you're using, of course, water while painting, hence the form watercolor, which you talk about. But you also tell us that in the video that water is not confused, which I think is an impactful statement. Could you tell me more about all of this?
Where I grew up in a place called 𝘓𝘳𝘰𝘮, which is a small channel, I suppose, our boat harbor now in what we now call Masset, New Masset. The house that we grew up in was built at the very edge of the intertidal zone, and come the springtime with those great tides, the ocean would slowly rise up and come right up and touch the house, the walls of the house, and I could look down and I could see that my house was in the water, and there was water under the house. And so there was a little bit of I don't want to overstate it, but a bit of an anxiety to it, but there was an excitement to the fact that water was so certain about itself that it would come up and touch us in that personal way, but not threaten us. It would not sweep the house away. Now, I'm not sure that's the case anymore, given climate change. But my relationship with water, playing in it, playing with it, watching the creatures in the water, there was a magic, and there still is a magic and a huge depth of character in water. I think that the art form itself, again, well, I don't really have the design work on here, but if you see on this beaver here that the lip is large and then it narrows down and then it twists back. The design itself flows like water. It expands and it compresses, and you can watch water moving through a narrow channel. It's moving fast, it's moving strong, it is very certain about where it's going, and it's going quickly. And then it comes into a broad stretch, an expansion of self, perhaps, an expansion of the context. The shores pull back, you're feeling more comfortable with the people you're with the context, and the water slows down and it gets smooth and it spreads out. And that's what I mean about the certainty, and also the teaching of water. If there's an obstacle, the water will just patiently fill up the hole, fill it with water, and then continue on its path. It does not stop doing what it is intent on doing, so it is certain about itself. It's a great teacher.
That is beautiful, and it's so well articulated. Hawa, for sharing that. It really adds a beautiful element on top of all of these different ideas around water and what it does for us and what we can do for it. So I want to say, Hawa, thank you again for your time and willingness to be open and share these amazing stories and works with us. It has been an absolute privilege. And as we delve into the last bit of the storytelling event, please feel free to remain present as I tell the Haida story that my Nana taught me in my Skidegate Haida language. But prior to that, I want to ask if there's anything that you would like to add in conclusion.
Well, I suppose there's always lots to say, but I just want to thank the community in Vancouver, and particularly Gallery Jones. It is my first exhibit in 10 years in Vancouver. I've been really busy doing large murals, commission work, and they're going to other places. And so my attention has been over there, over the horizon. With the things that have happened in the last week or so, with the 215 children, the sort of re-traumatization of people, it seems that there needs to be more of a personal focus back on the place here. I want to say to Canada, we use the word settlers, and I think that's a misnomer. I think we need to acknowledge we are unsettled. We are confused, we are hurt, we are anxious, we're embarrassed, we're in denial. And if we want to be settled, if we want to feel better about who we are and how we live our lives, we need to pay the rent. It's quite simple. It's the Constitution of Canada says that we must have a treaty with Indigenous people. It's not the Indigenous peoples that are saying that, it's the Constitution, the rule of law in Canada. And as long as we don't have treaties and those kind of agreements with Indigenous people, we will remain unsettled. And as complex as it appears to be, it really simply comes down to pay the rent. Quit trying to kill the landlord, pay the rent.
I think that is so well put and so important to be put in that way. So again, I say Hawa for sharing that and your presence and everything you bring to this big circle of life that we're all trying to navigate together to achieve a very similar goal. So Hawa, again.
Okay, thank you, sister.
So continuing on, the story that I chose to tell today in the spirit of our current exhibitions is called 𝘓𝘦𝘳𝘠𝘮𝘳𝘬𝘓𝘬, which broadly translates to how the raven stole or how the raven got fresh water. And it was a story that was taught to me by my nanay, 𝘚𝘵𝘢𝘳𝘪𝘯𝘨. My nanay's name, my grandmother's name is 𝘚𝑵𝘢𝘢. And it goes like this. 𝘓𝘦𝘳𝘠𝘮𝘳𝘬𝘓𝘬 𝘗𝘦𝘳𝘢𝘳𝘪𝘯𝘨 𝘗𝘰𝘄𝑛𝑦𝑗𝑠𝑝𝑛𝑦𝑗𝑠𝑝𝑛𝑦𝑗𝑠𝑝𝑛𝑦𝑗𝑠𝑝𝑛𝑦𝑗𝑠𝑝𝑛𝑦𝑗𝑠𝑝𝑛𝑦𝑗𝑠𝑝𝑛𝑦𝑗𝑠𝑝𝑛𝑦𝑗𝑠𝑝𝑛𝑦𝑗𝑠𝑝𝑛𝑦. 𝘗𝘦𝘳𝘢𝘳𝘮𝑝𝑛𝑦𝑗𝑠𝑝𝑛𝑦𝑗𝑠𝑝𝑛𝑦𝑗𝑠𝑝𝑛𝑦. 𝘗𝑛𝑦𝑗𝑠𝑝𝑛𝑦𝑗𝑠𝑝𝑛𝑦𝑗𝑠𝑝𝑛𝑦𝑗 𝘗𝑦𝑗𝑠𝑝𝑛𝑦𝑗𝑠𝑝𝑛𝑦𝑗𝑠𝑝𝑛𝑦𝑗 Kunasta ilqada gankini. Wayadu itzqasqa. Gani khoya tilgui hitgan. Il hit gangan il kuda questala gandlike pocket. Gani quandul suai quan gista aging. Qad lana guasi aging. Ganyuga quan pocket gun. Wayad skina river han kiapaga. A sing quan pocket gun. Wayad nas river han kiapaga. Quandul quan tana qua pocket gun. Ganu hide guai qala hit gun ganu quandul cut to il kuda qua aging. Gam quandul quap hodala hide guai gu pocket panga. Digi dang uji spartagi the la waffle kilmaga. Hawa. I'm now going to translate the story that my nana gave me to the best of my abilities. This story takes place after a great flood. So it goes, the water finally receded after the great flood. But all the water on earth was salty and no one could drink it. Raven heard that the wolf kept the only spring of fresh water for themselves. The wolf lived on the mainland, and the wolf did not tell anyone or anything where they were hiding the only freshwater resource. Raven decided that they were going to go look for it. Instead of flying, Raven decided to paddle their canoe across the ocean to Wolf's house. As Raven approached Wolf's home, Wolf hesitantly let Raven in. Raven said, "I'm thirsty. I rode from a long way." Wolf went to the spring and came back with a bowl full of fresh water for Raven. Raven drank a small amount and then it got late. Raven watched Wolf as they began to fall asleep as the sun went down. Then Raven drank all the water and flew up to the ceiling of Wolf's house. Raven tried to escape through the smoke hole. But Raven had drank so much water that their stomach was too big and they became stuck. Raven was making lots of noise trying to wiggle through the small hole. And in this noise, Raven woke up Wolf, and Wolf became angry seeing that Raven had taken something from Wolf and was trying to escape with this fresh water. Wolf put fir boughs in the fire, which created a thick smoke in the small home. Raven started coughing really hard and couldn't breathe. Raven had a very hard time getting out of the smoke hole, but they managed to squeeze through after a long struggle. And the traces of this adventure with Wolf and Raven remain today. Raven's once white feathery cloak was turned a sooty black because Raven was stuck in the smoke hole as dark smoke surrounded them. And this is why most ravens are black today. Raven quickly flew away. While they were flying, drops of fresh water dripped from their bill. These became lakes, ponds, and rivers of fresh water, but this happened on the mainland as Raven flew. Suddenly, lots of water fell out at once as Raven approached the coast. This became the Skeena River. Lots fell out again, and this became the Nass River. From these rivers, lots of water ran towards the ocean as if they were following Raven's flight path from below. By the time Raven reached Haida Gwaii, only a few drops of water remained in their bill. Raven dropped what they had left for their people. And this is why there are no large bodies of water on Haida Gwaii today. Thank you for listening to my story. So this story takes place, as mentioned, after another story titled 𝘓𝘦𝘢𝘮𝘳𝘊, the flood. It picks up from where the flood story ends, with there being no fresh water left on Haida Gwaii or anywhere after the ocean came up and onto the land. When Raven found out that Wolf on the mainland was hoarding the only freshwater spring left for themselves, Raven went out on a search to fulfill their wants and needs, as Raven usually does. Of course, Raven did not ask to take the water and went about getting the water in such a way to trick the wolf, which resulted in the black color we see ravens as today. The story tells us from Haida knowledges how freshwater resources came to be along the west mainland coast and onto Haida Gwaii, and also tells us why there are few large bodies and rivers of freshwater on Haida Gwaii today. It should be noted that although Raven may have tricked the wolf to get fresh water, Raven not only was doing it for themselves, but also for Raven's people, the Haida people, and the neighboring nations along the mainland coast. Raven provided us with our most important resource, water. I want to say 𝘓𝘓 again to Michael for joining us today. And in reflection of this event, I have come to see how this collaboration promoted two special forms of art in relation to our current exhibitions. Michael's regarding visual art and story, and mine regarding language and oral storytelling, which I think is a really beautiful process. Thank you everyone for being a part of this event and sharing this digital space with us all today. It is bittersweet for me as this concludes my last event as the Indigenous Programmer at Two Rivers Gallery. However, I know this is definitely not the end of my involvement with this beautiful community. Keep an eye out for future perspectives through storytelling events encompassed under our Learning from Sharing umbrella, working alongside future exhibitions with community partners and with our new Indigenous Programmer. So 𝘓𝘓, take care and be safe.